Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report, and we are back. The first episode of the last month of the year, so we'll probably only got four more this year for 2020 in review, which is going to be well, boy, that's going to be a big episode, isn't it? That's probably going to be like
Yep.
3 hours long at this rate. I mean, I know our 2018 review was like 2 hours. We did a bit better on 2019 review, which was an hour and a half, but so much has happened this year, just all around that it's going to warrant quite just I don't even know how to put this, but lo and behold, we're in the final stretch of probably the craziest year in recent memory, and trust me, it's only going to get crazier. And, we'll start out with the most recent news, which, the battle for the election is still ongoing. There's news out of Georgia that looks promising for Trump. You get all these things. You get, like, and again, it's hard to keep all these stories straight because you never know what is reality. You never know what is just angry liberals. You never know what is just I hate to use the phrase, but like Trump supporters coping, even though, again, there's been some valid points made, like, oh, yeah, okay, it's clear that something was afoot this election and that there was some level of at least some sort of misconduct, but the fact that the army is going to raid all these warehouses and find all these votes for Trump and, Q was right this whole time, I don't entirely buy into that. I'm not saying that, Trump has lost this year. I'm not saying that there isn't still a lot out there that could flip this for him, but a lot of it does boil down to fantasy and just high hopes. But I don't know. Things are looking more and more promising for Trump each day. Even though I know I said last episode, it looks like it looks like Biden's gonna get it. And Biden and Harris have been suspiciously quiet lately. They haven't been doing the normal quote unquote president elect sort of routine where they go around, they meet with officials, they plan their cabinets. Well, they have to a degree, but again, it hasn't been as much, for example, as Trump in 2016 or Obama in '08 or Bush in 2000. You haven't really seen that to the point where, they'll have this confidence, they'll stand out there, they'll act like they won the election, but they don't seem entirely certain. And I know maybe this isn't the best thing to judge it by, but Kamala still has not resigned from the Senate, which, keep in mind, Obama resigned from the Senate on the Friday or I think Thursday or Friday after he won his first election. You have a lot of people who resigned from the previous posts they're holding in office at the time resign within days of the election or if they're certain they've won. In a lot of cases, again, 2000 notwithstanding, I don't know if when Bush resigned as governor of Texas, I imagine probably on December 12th after the Supreme Court pretty much said, you won Florida, you won this election. But again, I think there's still a lot up in the air, and we're in the final stretch. There is, as we're recording this, 9 days before the electoral. There's 11 days before the electoral college meets. It's the 14th, not the 12th. 12th was Bush's court case. So, but there's 11 days recording this. By the time you watch this, will be 10 days. Where on December 14th, which I believe is a Saturday. Let me check. I think it falls on a set. It's falls on a Monday this year. Okay, I was off, but regardless, that's when we will know who the president is. So we'll know within the next two episodes, and we'll know what to look forward to. And I'm thinking these last 2 weeks here are going to be very hectic in terms of all the news, whether legitimate or fake, that comes out about this. To the point where everyone's going to be pushing. Everyone's going to throw out everything they have in these last minutes here. You thought election day was for that? You're wrong. That was just the beginning of this. It's going to be the day the electoral college convenes, where we're going to see the real insanity. And you know what? Of course, the gut thing to say is if the electoral college confirms Trump, then he will obviously reassume office, and there will be a lot of street violence. No surprise. I imagine there will be street violence under Biden, but probably not as much. It's probably more like hooligan celebratory violence, like you get after soccer for our international audiences, football games in Europe. So I imagine it'll be more that kind of violence rather than the outraged violence of Trump one. But yeah, again, we're in the final stretch of this insanity to figure out who really won this election, and I'm really looking forward to it. If you would force me to pick, if you had to say, okay, sit down right now on December 3rd, 2020, if I had to pick one candidate I think was going to be the winner, who I think the Electoral College confirmed, I'd hate to say it, but I think Biden has it as of now. Now, again, as more information comes out, as we get close to the day, we'll probably get a clearer image. But as for now, unfortunately, I would say Biden probably has it in the bag. I'm not saying Trump is completely down for the count, but it still looks more favorable for Biden.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I often think about, like, what kind of scenarios will come about. Let's say Trump miraculously wins this, right? I mean, he would have to call on martial law, but realistically, is that even going to happen? Is anyone really going to do anything about that? Shortly after CHOP, whatever you want to call it, was established in Seattle, uh, protesters were trying to create the same thing in Washington. And when Trump asked for military police to essentially stop it, or just asked for the military to stop something like that happening, they said no. And that's over something quite small. So who would back him exactly, right? Um, I mean, it's a tantalizing thought. You would hope that the amount of people he's fired his, I think, his CIA chief, and so on, almost like he's expecting, like, to have the next 4 years as a kind of a carte blanche to decide his second term strategy. You know, zero F's given, and so on. He's not, but really, is that even feasible, right? Like, the kind of machinery that he's set against is not going to let him happen. It is not going to let that happen. Um, but I do think about that, and I mean, if he did win, it would be catastrophic for the states. I think for the states, anyways. I mean, you look at polls, and it's something like 80% of Republicans and even about 25% of Democrats believe that not only was there fraud, but that the election was stolen. Um, for outright stolen, it's 45%, 47%. If you want to talk about fraud, I would say the majority of the public now believes this was a fraudulent election. And for most people, it'll beat, like, Barr, for instance, said, yeah, there's fraud, but it wouldn't be enough to change the outcome, which is quite strange, right? I mean, this is the country that topples regimes around the world for being illiberal democracies or fake democracies. I mean, really, no one can talk shit anymore. Like, if Kazakhstan has an election that you think is fraudulent, well, sit down, like, and keep
But
your
you don't
mouth shut.
understand. Lukashenko needs to step down. Okay, like
Yeah.
democracy. Tinovskaya, which we will discuss later, she clearly won. She's clearly the legitimate winner, as said by the American elite. Which and as we all know, they have the most utmost integrity for elections. Nothing went on in Philadelphia. Nothing went on in Atlanta. Nothing went on in Detroit. Any of that is just that is just hearsay. That is just hooey. That is conspiracy theory, and I will have none of it.
Yeah. So, but we are seeing this kind of rapid decline of neoliberalism on some level. We're definitely seeing the decline of democracy. Uh, it's becoming more and more an obstacle, in a sense that you have different sides who have a vision of where the country should go, and democracy is getting in the way. Um, so overall, there's a loss of faith, and you could say that on a micro level, there's a loss of faith that Americans have for their own institutions, and on a macro level, there's a loss of faith that the rest of the globe has, both in America and with the West in general. Because, I mean, it's kind of obvious now, right? The fact that there cannot be even a kind of civil and open debate, right? Like the idea that, I mean, I don't think anybody in their right mind questions that there is fraud. So why won't they engage in debating the issue of fraud as a serious problem with democracy? After all, the West is going to have democracies for quite a bit, after 2020. It's only going to crop up again. Like 2024 is going to have accusations of fraud. The next major election in the EU will probably have questions of fraud. Someone will bring it up, and it's just going to gather more and more and more exposure, or let's say it will question the system more and more. So why not have like a civil discussion about it? Why not have experts talk about it? And the fact that you can't, right? That the fact that one side is sidelined, um, it just makes people even more suspicious.
Oh yeah, I absolutely. I don't see the. I don't know, when's the next May? Oh, 2021. September 2021 is the upcoming German election. So we'll see how those turn out because that's a major player in Europe. 2022 is France. Let's see, UK. They did theirs last year, so they're probably not going to be until 2024 as well. Yeah, so right off the bat, like 2 years in a row, you get major European elections out of Germany and France, and I don't know if there's any other ones. The Italian government, the Spanish government, those could collapse any time, so we'll see how those work out. But again, being the standard bearer for the West, for lack of a better term, what happens in the United States politically, culturally, etc., but in this case, especially politically, is going to reverberate throughout the West to the point where, again, German elections, the Germans are, stereotypically a bit more of an efficient people, but I imagine there'll be no shortages of cries of fraud or deceit or anything else of that regard. The French, especially when you get into Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, there's going to be all sorts of shrill cries of election rigging, whatever, especially getting to Poland and Hungary. That's going to be interesting. Let's see, Hungarian elections, there were 2018, so 2023 will be Hungary, which that'll be another one to watch out for. If we haven't been driven off the internet by then, we'll be there to cover it. You never know how it is with these sort of websites. They could erase us tomorrow, but let's not worry about that for now. Let's just enjoy the time we have together for now. But yeah, it will be interesting to see this going forward, and I don't think this is the death knell of democracy in the West, but I think it's pretty close. I think we're getting close to it. Maybe not
Yeah,
in the next few election
we,
cycles, but probably in my lifetime. I don't know about yours. I don't know. I really can't say when this is coming.
yeah. I mean, 6 years ago, I was, talking to friends, uh, after I'd, read, the decline of the West and about Caesarism and, you know, various stages of civilizations, their breaking points, and so on. Um, and it really is kind of remarkable. You were saying that 2020 is quite a year, and the way that 2020 was so condensed, and it had such qualities of acceleration. I would say the last 5 years have been that as well. Like if I could have sum up like the half of this last decade, I would say it's like 2020, with regards as to how quickly everything has sped, right? The disillusionment with democracy, the both the disillusionment with neoliberal and democratic values, and at the same time a more authoritarian approach to both enshrine them but also enforce them as a as a proper as a belief system, as a pedagogy. um, it really is quite something. 2020 is very different than 2015 in that respect. All the signs were there, but the intensity wasn't. Not to this level. You literally can't you literally can't own the libs. There's very serious consequences, and they are trying to create this atmosphere of fear and self censorship. So yeah, it's I mean, there's no, I don't know about you. I think you agree. There is no way to resuscitate this, right? Like it isn't going to work. Like no one is going to be able to believe in democracy all over again. Um, it's not just the disillusionment. It's not just like say the ethnic differences, the lack of a cohesive idea about what a civilization should be. I mean, in the West, there isn't even really a cohesive idea of what is beauty, something that has always been integral to civilization. And part of the reason there can't be and won't be is
Well,
because,
we all know that black is beautiful.
yes. So part of that, part of the reason for that is that the society is made up of many races and many ethnicities and cultures. And so they can't agree on that, right? You can't. You'll offend somebody. But at the same time, there's parallel to that is what I was saying earlier about a disillusionment of just democracy in general.
Yeah, democracy is not coming back from this one, and I say this as somebody who used to be under these, you know, I suppose say idealistic delusions that democracy can still work. We just need to limit the franchise. If only people at a stake in society could vote. If only we could do one vote for households. Only landowners, net taxpayers can vote. Yeah, look, I'm sure that would improve the situation, but I mean, by how much? At this rate, especially now. Number one, let's say you could implement that. Let's just get that massive question out of the way. You think that would change the system? You think there'd be any less trickery going on? You think the political structure would change radically? Yeah, okay, Republicans might win more elections, but what are Republicans going to continue to do? Push the liberal agenda both at home and abroad. It's not going to change much. You might get some concessions. You might get some lower taxes. Easier to start a business, and slightly. What your kids learn in school might not be as egregious, but nonetheless, it still will be. But I really, again, there'll be. I think we still got a few good decades of democracy left, but as a long-term institution, I think Spangler's bit off. I think we're going to start to fall into Caesarism a few decades, after it predicted. But I think for most people watching this now, I just looking at the average age of my audience and considering the age of myself, I think most of us will be alive to see the age of new Caesars, as it were. And which I'm not necessarily complaining about. That don't get me wrong. It may come as a welcome relief, depending on who those Caesars are. Because again, I think that's what the big battle is nowadays, and I think most people don't even realize it. Because I think they realize it on a subconscious level, but they don't realize it. Because you have the right pushing like Trump or bust, which again is I have my problems with Trump. It's a respectable attitude though, where they want their guy in power, they want their guy to be the strong man. The left has been blatant about this for years. Just now the right is coming around to it, but I think both on a certain level recognize that yeah, we're coming back to an era of strongmen where it's personal regimes where it's the one man's word is law. And I think we're seeing that pan out right now, especially with Trump versus Biden. Now, again, this election won't be that sort of system, but I think it's a precursor to the kind of political battles we're looking at. And I think 2020 has really set the stage for that, especially in the election. And in retrospect, I think more people will start to realize that.
Right, and you can see the kind of slow evolution of politics in the West in the last 300 years, going from monarchy to parliamentary monarchy to just outright parliament, republics, and so on, and in the way that the real power brokers in a society had to be concealed, because basically of the tyrant mythology, right? The big bad tyrant, and so what you have is this kind of oligarchy in the background, and the difficulty will be in the way people at the moment still want to believe that their vote is worth something, that their vote actually determines something.
Cue
And to a
every
small,
corporate and social media campaign over the summer.
right. So, I mean, there is, but this sort of semi chaos is also well managed, right? And um, I don't know how they're like you say, it'll probably be another 10 years, but there is a growing sense that with many that like you can't have the republic if you um, move towards more and more popular democracy. You lose the republic, or the republic is in danger of losing itself. Whether that might be, let's say, China, or whether that may be um, just in the makeup of the country. But there's a growing sense that democracy is now the enemy of the republic itself.
Oh, absolutely. Now that you brought up China, I think it's a good time to move into our next topic, which is just this entire I don't even know how you call it. This entire dispute between China, between Australia, India, bringing the United States, of course. But again, yeah, this started and is mainly focused around a new rivalry. I wouldn't say rivalry is the word, but new point of dispute between China and Australia. That boils down to trade, that boils down to just diplomatic relations in general. Of course, we all know that China's been really increasing its economic and political influence in Australia over the past, I don't know, 5 years maybe, and that Australia has sort of let it happen to the chagrin of a lot of right wingers across the world, especially in Australia, especially in the Anglosphere. That yeah, it's been sort of out of all the cases, out of all the talk of China and Chinese influence, Australia is probably one of the few cases where the hype meets the reality, where it actually is almost as bad, if not as bad, as they're actually talking about. Because a lot of Chinese investment, a lot of Chinese money in Australia, to say the least. A lot of Chinese people in Australia, no less. Now, what we have with that, of course, is now this new dispute arises and the United States gets involved. We err more on the side of Australia, and this at the time that uh, new video footage is leaking out of the war in Afghanistan about war crimes allegedly committed by Australian troops, and China's been browbeating with that, and Australia's been coming back with human rights violations of China, all the usual stuff, and of course, India is now taking this opportunity to pivot more and more westward, as we've seen over the past few years. We've seen the Namaste Trump rally. I'm sure you all remember that. I think that was that 2019 or was this year? I think it was 2019 because it was right before the Indian elections. But you have that. You have India pivoting away from sort of its. I'm not saying it's broken relations with Russia or that they have bad relationships now, but they're moving away from the very comfortable relationship they had with Russia towards the United States, towards Australia, towards the Anglosphere, the West, etc. And as we'll get into in a couple minutes here, that plays out in migration, HB1 visas, and the other sort of immigration laws, and the growing Indian class within, especially the United States, but to a lesser extent, all other places across the Anglosphere. You'd think Canada, Australia, UK, etc. But it's interesting watching all these things play out in conjunction with one another, especially considering the fact beyond the coronavirus scare, news out of China has been rather quiet this year.
Yeah, and a lot of this is uh, you can look at it as just kind of the surface of the greater conflict, right? So in 2014, a treaty was signed that included Australia, America, Japan, and India. A reciprocal It's not technically a treaty. Like they're not technically forming an alliance. It is a bloc. It is informal. But what it basically says is Japanese military can situate itself in de facto Australian territory and vice versa. And so this applies to all four of those countries. And it's been ratcheted up. Like you could potentially see this turn into an alliance in the next 10 years. Biden getting in I don't believe, is going to change that. Just as much as I don't believe that Biden getting in is going to bring back the JPCOA. I don't think that's going to happen. In many ways, this kicking of the can was, especially with regards to China, is just it was. I think when you look at the Obama administration and you look at the way, I guess, if destroying certain countries in the Middle East during Arab Spring is a success, then Arab Spring to a great degree was a success to some degree. And tearing away most of Ukraine away from Russia, that was a success. And so you can understand why there was confidence in the way the Obama administration, but in both terms, conducted itself. But I think that, whether there was going to be a Trump or not, there was going to eventually be a reckoning day with China. And a lot of this tit for tat right now, these accusations of, which may be true, of Australian soldiers tormenting Afghani kids. I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm just saying that's just a surface level conflict, right? That's what's going to be used for the moral argument of a much deeper crisis. And the reason this is going on is because, of course, they want to limit China's trade abilities going through the Indian Ocean from the West Pacific, right? That's mainly what this is about. Is to stop that. Like, up until this point, you could say that in the post-World War II era, America became the chief guarantor of trade worldwide, right? So all these shipping lanes that are protected, and countries have to pay their dues in order to be part of this, right? But only America had the fleet and the capability to take over the mantle that the British Empire had established. And then on top of that, go one extra step in terms of the sheer vastness of it all and the increased, just the density of trade. Because, you could be on a small Pacific island, and even some places isolated as that, somewhere in the Fiji Islands, they might produce something which could be traded. And so they're brought into this larger trade global complex, right? And China at the moment does not have a fleet that can guarantee that, right? One would presume that China is working on it, but it's not at that level. At the moment, it still requires a kind of partnership with the U.S., but that partnership is deteriorating very quickly. And this is where both Japan, Australia, and India see an opportunity to work with America in order to limit the amount of Chinese economic power and Chinese geopolitical strategy. Because economically, it's inevitable that China is going to overtake the U.S., right? And internally, it's more cohesive. It has its problems, and all countries do. And I don't want to minimize. China's is not a country, for instance, that has small internal problems. It has, on the face of it, some very large ones, but they're not any larger than what faces the United States. So it will be about having this guarantee of trade routes to still function smoothly. So we'll see how far it goes. We'll see what kind of chances China is willing to take, because China does not have the land, neither to feed its people, neither to provide the resources that it needs. It depends on its financial power, its economic power, and trade power in order to broker deals with these other countries, right? And what's good for them is that the deals are good. And if you look at the last 20 years and you see the kind of sweep that it's made across the world, replacing America as the largest trading partner of like some of the top 25 countries in the world, then you get an idea of why there is this fear. So, we're still, just to reiterate, we're still well off from China developing a kind of navy that can provide that kind of trade. China's power cannot come to complete fruition on the global level, let's say in a true parity of that of the US, without that fleet. And now it's going to be challenged.
In terms of, to further your point, Chinese naval capabilities, their main strides have been in, I would say, more so defensive weapons, such as the
Right.
hypersonic missiles, things that would counteract the American Navy if they were pushed into a head to head conflict. Not something that could, for example, compete with them as a guarantor of global sea routes, protecting from undesirables, maybe such as piracy or any other various problems that may occur at sea. You're not seeing that. As far as that goes, the American Navy is still completely unchallenged. And
Right. 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 So, and so China, you can see in its diplomacy, is acting on the one level like any other country, saying, "Okay, fine, you're the leader of the world of the world, both symbolically and economically. Um, you own the trade routes to a certain degree. Why is it that we can't, get along?" But inevitably, I mean, everybody knows that underneath the surface that there is going to be this challenge, and like what America fears is it's going to become a kind of mercenary fleet for Chinese trade. And I'm very sure that China believes that it can successfully do that, because although they are rapidly developing their offensive abilities, both naval and ground, right? Like you say, it's still not there. They have enough to defend themselves that countries which think that they can boss them around in their own, in their own backwater, as it were, uh, would, would be remiss. They would rather not, right? But when you're talking about a trade route that goes, from Cairo to Hong Kong, with let's say routes go deep inside the Persian Gulf, um, that's not there yet, not remotely. And so it'll be interesting to see if we have a Biden administration, what they're going to do. Are they going to negotiate um, to become like a protector of Chinese trade? What kind of deal will have to be hammered out in order for that to be achieved? Because that's what it will take for there not to be a conflict,
oh,
right?
absolutely.
Right. That is what will take. I don't see the One Belt One Road initiative. I mean, I can understand why they would want that to be successful, because it would be something that they could have more control over, and it would bypass, American surveillance, so to speak, right? But that's not very well developed, and it's no better developed than the Chinese Navy, which again, I'm not berating the Chinese Navy. The Chinese Navy, every year, is stronger than it was previously. If you look at it on a decade by decade basis, you can see that where the trend is going. It's very clear. There's nothing ambiguous about it. But that will be interesting, and you can see why Trump as well decided he could put the screws on China, and why that was effective, right? To some degree, there's no question that China wanted Biden to win because they believe that they could have something of the Obama years back and a similar attitude.
Yeah, similar to why Russia wanted Trump to win in 2016 and to a degree in 2020. That it's less pressure on them, it's less aggression towards them, and
Right.
it's not like these. Again, the narratives you'll see, the Democrats say this about Trump, the Republicans say this about Biden. They were installed by this foreign power. They're colluding with this foreign power. It's not even necessarily that. It's the fact that they view them as less of a concern than the other primary rival. For again, the Republicans, that's China. For the Democrats, that's Russia. And if if Russia and or China can deflect the blame or attention to one another, they're definitely going to do that, which is a very interesting clashing of interests between the two. That I don't know, it doesn't really seem to affect their relationship, but you would think that something like that would.
Yeah, I mean, you saw a little bit of that when China claimed that Vladivostok was actually Chinese clay. I don't think Russia doesn't take that kind of stuff very seriously. Um, I mean, it takes the Kuril Islands far more seriously than Vladivostok is really a Chinese city. Uh, in a way, Russia has to work with China because it's not that America wants to tear Russia away from China. They need to subjugate Russia before they can tear away Russia from China, right?
Oh
The whole
yes,
point
and
is China.
to
The
further
whole
your
point.
point, weren't they saying that Russian East Asia was going to be completely colonized by the Chinese by now? Isn't that what they were saying in
Oh,
2000?
I've been hearing that for 20 years
Yeah,
now.
yeah, that's what they, yeah, that's what they were immediately. I don't know how the two things related, but that's what they were all saying after 9/11, the rise of the war on terror. That Russia's in decline. It'll all be Chinese soon anyway, and I'm still waiting on that. I'm pretty sure Vladivostok's more Russian than either Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Right, and so yeah, I mean, the same applies to China, right? Like they want China to have like a semi-sovereignty. They don't want it to have a complete sovereignty. Like they don't want a sovereignty that uh, is parallel to America's.
Yeah, and just to sort of round this out, as we brought up at the beginning, India was part of this, but I think we're noticing something, especially in relationship to the rival with China, this new, I would say, appeal to India. The American elites are desperately looking to win over India, as are the Indian elites looking to win over America. Now, this is evident most recently this week. The Senate voted near unanimously, I believe actually unanimously, for another high skilled immigration act, which again, that primarily comes from India. People who come over here, high skilled immigration is just a code for the people who will do middling office jobs for half the price you would. And that's what you see in a lot of tech jobs, a lot of the H-1Bs is the really big issue about that. The point where there seems to be a desire from both the American and Indian elite to have this intermarriage that you say America had with China throughout the 70s through the 90s up until recently, up until the sort of divorce that happens. The Indian elites want to play the game China did to rise India to the level that China is now, which I see it as even more insidious than the Chinese rise because, yes, there was a lot of economic interdependence when it came to Chinese relations. There was a lot of infiltration, hell, on both sides when it came to the American Chinese relationship. But just the sheer amount of high caste Indians that come to the United States and get into universities, get into tech jobs, get into corporate jobs, it dwarfs what China ever could have dreamed of. Because even throughout the time of economic cooperation with China, there was still somewhat of an understanding throughout the Cold War, I would say up until the 90s at least, that China was still something of a rival. Sure, we had a common foe in the Soviet Union, but there wasn't a complete trust of China as there seems to be of India. Like, you would have never had Reagan going to a rally with the premier of China, how Trump did with Modi last year. That would have never happened. But
Right.
what you're seeing here is, and I noted this off air, you get these high caste Brahmin elite in India who love Trump. Namaste Trump. They buy into it. Big Modi supporters. And then they send their kids over here to go get a Western education. They send them to New York, LA, Chicago, all these big cities. Go learn the American universities. Go get educated in some of the, best institutions in the world, whatever. And these become the same people writing for the New York Times or whatever who are just the face of the anti-Trump resistance. And Trump is so awful. Trump is so horrible. I can't believe that he would do this. People don't accept me. People are racist towards me because I'm Indian. And especially with the women, they marry into upper class white families. Like I said, especially the high caste Brahmin women, they love to marry white men. There's a bit of the reverse. There's plenty of Indian men who marry the white women. It's much less than the other way around. But again, you're seeing these tactics of infiltration. I would say more appropriately ingratiation, because infiltration would imply a degree of subtlety about it. Should remind you of a certain other massive foreign lobby we have in this country. Y- you know, uh, what that really reminds me of? Such as perhaps,
Mm.
Bush's two daughters, both married people of this group. Trump's kids are married to people
Yeah.
of these groups. Biden's children are married to people of these groups. Again, it's exactly like the Israeli influence in this country. That's what I'm seeing right
Yeah.
here. It's even worse because the current relationship with India is like a hybrid of the Israeli infiltration and the Chinese infiltration, to the point where I don't know, they've seemed to have gotten a pretty good grasp, maybe a mastery on both of them, and are applying both of them. They're intermarrying, they're getting involved in our business, they're becoming large economic partners, to the point where I think, not to downplay China, not that I'm saying, China's our great friend or again, we've been over in the show. We have a very nuanced opinion of the Chinese situation. You don't have to like China, but I also don't expect you to be like full like we need to support Taiwan against whatever the Hong Kong protester base. No, no. Look, it's okay not to like China, but it's also okay to not support those other things. Is what I'm getting at. But what I'm seeing right now, to bring this long-winded tangent to a close, is further down the road, regardless of what happens to China, whether that be a rise, whether that be complete collapse, I think India, while they may be friendly now, while they may be on good terms now, much longer down the road, maybe 50, 60 years, in terms of the amount of infiltration and the ingratiation they've done, are a much longer term threat to the United States than China is.
That's possible, because the truth of the matter is, India is not going to be able to compete with China economically on the level of innovation. They're not there. They have mass, which is something China had, but the kind of change, the kind of long term planning that they would have to do in order to be a true rival to China will take decades. And this is, you can see why this is a great advantage for America, because India will be highly dependent on America. And it's a much more asymmetrical relationship, and it's a much more dependent relationship. India has an important bit of territory in the Indian Ocean, and it can act as a block to Chinese trade. India itself is afraid of being swallowed up by the Chinese economy, because frankly, it cannot compete. Um, the Western manufacturers that have China moved to China in the first place because they got the most competent workers for the lowest price imaginable anywhere on the planet. Period. End of story. That's why they're there. And that's why also, Biden being such a corporate man, as was Hillary, what we're afraid of this like jolting break with China initiating that. Because frankly, a lot of their companies that have moved there don't want this. And it would take decoupling would take decades, and it couldn't begin with a confrontation. I'm speaking on, let's say, from the perspective of Apple and several other manufacturers, right? So that's kind of the way I see it. They're going to, like, again, India is basically like, I would say, at least a quarter of a century behind China. And a lot of the youth that come here who are extremely wealthy and well off in India do so because India, and this will further explain what I mean about the differences between India and China, is India simply doesn't have the infrastructure, the kind of, this word has been circulating in Twitter for quite a while. They don't have the bodegas, they don't have that New York has. They watch Western films, and it's like, literally, I can't believe Evan on Twitter had a banger of a tweet. It was just amazing. I went to my local bodega and I got a toothbrush and espresso. How is the city real? My life feels like a film. Well, I mean, that works with a lot of Indian youth, right? They have all this wealth, they have all this security, and I mean, I can just say I know this on a personal level through friends from that region. Rather, they're mates. They're the mates of some of my friends.
Yeah, that's even
And
bigger in Canada than it is here, isn't it?
it is. It's huge. Toronto, especially, right? And like you wonder, like, why would you come here? You left a home with 5 servants. Your father is a dean at a university and is still a practicing surgeon. Why come here? Right? And the reason is they have all this wealth, they have all this money and security, but they don't have a country where they feel that they can actually enjoy it. Right? Because frankly, the infrastructure isn't there. Right? So for them, it's a question of both luxury and status, right? The status is to be here. Here is where you can finally interlock your wealth with luxury, right?
Yeah, and unlike a lot of other migrant groups, one may think Latin America, it's not even necessarily that they're funneling their money home because, again, they come from wealth, they come from privilege. Whereas, like, workers from Guatemala, El Salvador, maybe less so Mexico nowadays, when they come here, they, again, usually work low skill jobs, usually work manual labor jobs, and they send their money to their family in Mexico where it's worth much more because of the conversion rate. But, again, with these people, America, the West, and again, mainly the Anglosphere. It's mainly places like the U.S., Canada, and Britain are the main three. I'd say it's the ideal rather than a means to an end. And even with some high skill immigrants, I'd say even with the Chinese, like it's also to a degree, it's a means to an end where they'll come here, they'll reap the resources, they'll get what they can out of it, but their ultimate desire is to return home. No, but you make a good point with the Indians. The desire is the West. India is not the West. It's again, it's a general it's a general love for at least what the West is nowadays, the hyper-capitalist, the neoliberal West, I suppose you could say. I doubt they're exactly in love with the traditional cathedrals of Europe, so to speak. But at the end of the day, that's what they want. They look. I mean, sure, I'm sure they're happy being high caste Brahmin with their several servants with their rich family, but at the end of the day, that's still not good enough for them. It's because, again, it's still not the Western world. It's still not what they see in Hollywood movies. It's still, again, they want to live in New York. They want to live in LA, etc.
Yeah, yeah. Because and it's an irony, right? Because on the one hand, being wealthy in India, in a way, the kind of lack of infrastructure and the poverty there, in a sense, accentuates both their wealth and it kind of nullifies it because there isn't an interlocutor of their wealth in the way that they see that the way that integration has happened in Western Europe, in cities like London and New York and Berlin and Stockholm and so on, right? They can be phenomenally wealthy, but they cannot enjoy it the same way. And at the same time, when they do come to the West, they don't. They will lose their high caste position.
You
So,
know what this honestly reminds me of? A much more contemporary example, or maybe not contemporary, but I suppose it is, but a much more, I would say, relatable example, something a lot more people will get. The
mm,
Arabs who come to this country, especially from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, etc., the ones who come from the high caste families, the one who come from, their father is some oil sheik in Dubai or whatever. And again, they come here and they don't necessarily carry the same high status their family name would get them at home. Sure, they have the money, but again, they don't have the exact same social status because of their name, because of their titles or whatever.
yeah, yeah, it is very similar in that way.
Yeah, but I do think it is interesting that again, I especially at this point, I don't think in terms of productivity, India can outcompete China, but I think they're much closer to that than probably any other country in the world, and their elites
Mm,
still act more like the elite in the Gulf countries rather than the Chinese countries, where the
yeah.
desire is integration with the West. And again, they're taking the strategy of again countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia when it comes to ingratiating themselves with the West rather than China, which again, like I said, it's kind of a hybrid method, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to this, but there's been a push over the past few years to have this what a great ally India is. They stand up to Islamic extremism, they stand up to the Chinese, whatever. But I do think there is a realization by plenty on the right, and I would say plenty especially on our corner of the right, that India is not the friend of the West, of the United States, etc., that is portrayed to be. They're sort of, again, just dirty opportunists, and not, I mean, that's pretty much the entire world, but again, a lot of the world doesn't, sugarcoat it like that. Whereas we're being told by the media, we're being told by our politicians, we're being told by all these different people that India is this genuine friend who wants a partnership with the United States. But realistically, you look at it, and it's no different than the way these other countries treat us. These other countries try to take advantage of us. And that's not to say that like, of course, we let it happen. It's not like we make any effort to prevent it. I mean, our political class is fully on board with it, and just as much
Hmm.
benefiting from it. But and again, I could see I don't know, maybe in 10, 15 years, some Democrat, not necessarily Democrat, but some politician coming out with the same rhetoric against India, sort of that Trump ran with China in 2016, that these trade deals aren't fair, this relationship is not fair, they're taking us for a ride and we need to do something about it. And again, that's also depending on, what's our relationship look like in 15 years with China? Are we still in this interdependent relationship? Are we in a completely new Cold War? Whatever. But, there's a lot of things up in the air, but again, I see, especially for people like us, especially for people who hold our ideas or ideas similar to ours, that issues with India are going to be a much larger focus over the next few years.
Hmm. Hmm.
But with that, I suppose we should move on to the two big news stories out of Eastern Europe, starting with Belarus, of course.
Sure.
So, she just doesn't quit. The so-called I don't know, perhaps to conform with media standards of the United States, President-elect of Belarus, Svetlana
Yeah.
Tikhonovskaya, put out a tweet today, or her team did, with some picture of her just looking like a real oh I'm big and in charge. I'm like a real girl boss with her arms crossed, her scarf all
Yeah,
the way
yeah,
up
yeah.
to her nose, whatever. And it says, "I officially declare that I am ready to lead Belarus during the transition period." Interesting, not the only major transition this week. Bonus points if you get that joke. We continue increasing pressures on Lukashenko's regime. Apparently, they're trying to spell it like in the Polish fashion, trying to really Latinize Belarus. To return
Yes, yes.
power to the people. This summer, I promise to hold free and fair presidential elections in Belarus. I am true to my word. So this is after her supposed day of reckoning, which is supposed to take place, over a month ago. I believe that was actually October 25th that was supposed to take place, or yeah, it was the 25th, wasn't it? Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, sometime at the end of
yeah,
October. But it's been about 5 weeks since then, and nothing's come of that. But hey, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do out of that? It's like, are you really gonna stand up to the strong and empowered woman? And this is, as we mentioned previously, patience for the opposition continues to decrease among Russia, continues to lose interest among the West. Not even President elect Biden or Vice President elect Kamala Harris have come out and said, oh, we support the democratic movements in Belarus in quite some time. They've been too focused on internal issues, and that's not to mention Biden's complete radio silence after his fall. Yeah, yeah. Just an aside. Biden did take a tumble on Sunday and was rushed to the hospital. Which, I mean, taking a fall at his age is honestly something that could do a lot of damage, if not do you in. So keep that in mind as this man is probably going to come into office. But what you have with all of this is her. I don't know what other word to give it than shrieking to maintain what little bit of relevance she has left, to just keep on it, to be like, I am strong and empowered and I will lead Belarus to the future, and the future is female, and Lukashenko is an evil patriarchal dictator, and we need new liberal leadership in Belarus. We need the EU to recognize me as the lesbian in chief of Belarus. Whatever the hell they're going
yeah,
with
yeah.
now, but it the more this fizzles out, the louder she gets, if you've noticed. And again, I think this is probably a great outcome for Belarus in terms of Lukashenko staying in power, but the fact that they were given such an incompetent opposition compared to the Ukrainian opposition in 2013 and 2014, where again you had torch marches through Kiev and other major cities to the point where it's like, oh, we're going to give these people, or they're going to violently seize it. I don't get the feeling that Tinovskaya is going to lead some sort of storming of the presidential palace anytime soon in Belarus. Again, there isn't that intimidation factor, and all I can say is, Lukashenko got really lucky with the opposition he was dealt.
Yeah, they seem willfully unprepared. Now, the argument by Tikhanovskaya is that, well, Lukashenko is leaving, uh, even though he's only leaving after a new constitution is drafted. In her eyes, I think she feels like a deal has been struck, and Moscow will be negotiating with her. She doesn't explicitly say that. And of course, on the one hand, you have Westerners who, as their democracies look more and more like parodies of democracy and far more fragile than they were a mere 10 years ago. You have the others, her supporters in Belarus who think like if they act like Westerners, right, they'll get rich. Like their countries won't be the same. Um, there's no explanation why things aren't improving in Ukraine, right? I mean, you're led to believe that if Ukraine had Crimea, then it would be like this awesome superpower. Or I don't know, like why isn't Romania doing great? Is Bulgaria not doing great? Like there's very few exceptions, like yeah, Czech is doing well. Poland, not bad. Slovakia, not terrible, but like, who's really doing great, right? I mean, on some level, they must know like this is really about giving them visas to move out of Belarus. Like, I think the ones that are pragmatic and honest with themselves, they have to realize that. So like I say, you know, it's a flex on her part, and to some degree, I'll give her that. It, that it is a bold move, even though you know I don't see her becoming the president. She even mentioned that she would hold another election immediately if she was recognized as the leader of Belarus. But surely Russia understands that there is no negotiating with the West after Ukraine. They must realize that, right? Now, the protests are not really that effective, but you have to argue that they are effective if Lukashenko is willing to resign. And work on the new constitution will begin in 2021. So, a lot of things are up in the air.
Even though, keep in mind, his resignation came shortly after his meeting with the Russian ambassador and Lavrov's
Yeah.
comments. So,
Yes, yes. And so, yes, absolutely. And so, who is going to replace him would probably not be Tikhanovskaya. It could be somebody we've never even heard of.
well, I think it's gonna be
Or
somebody we heard of. I think it's gonna be what's his name? Guy in charge of Russia right now. Beats me.
I can't. I
Medvedev.
can't.
That's who it is.
Well,
There we
Medvedev. Yeah,
there
yeah,
we go.
yeah.
Or I don't know. Maybe Lukashenko's gonna pull his final move and do what he couldn't in the '90s and actually become president of Russia himself. Who knows?
Base.
I mean, frankly, I think he would have gone down in history as one of the greatest leaders of his era if he was able to actually successfully pull it off, go from potato farm on Belarus to president of Union of Russia and Belarus. But again, the man shot himself in the foot, so it's kind of hard to feel bad for him. I can appreciate the meme of the man, but at a certain point, I think he kind of screwed himself is what I'm getting at. But you do make a point. It's probably not going to be Tinovskaya. That's something the West is going to use to grandstand on. You know who she reminds me of, but more insufferable.
Mhm.
Timoshenko.
Yes, yes, and it's hard to imagine someone more insufferable than her. But I think that's probably the future that she's going to have as well.
Relegated to irrelevance. Do you think she'll get the prison sentence? I don't know.
Do I? Sorry, can you rephrase that?
Do,
Do I
do,
think?
do you think, like Timoshenko, she's going to get the prison sentence at some point? Do you think she's going to get something dumb enough to get her thrown in a cell?
No, she won't be dumb enough to go back to Belarus if she thinks she's going to be arrested. No
Yeah,
way.
yeah. I mean, one could only hope, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I suppose the other big piece of news out of Eastern Europe is this whole scandal with the Hungarian minister. Now, again, this comes amid a very harsh internal EU conflict involving Poland and Hungary and the European Union, involving budgets, involving all this sort of yearly stuff the European Union does, and relative resistance from both Hungary and Poland, as is to be expected. And one of the stories that comes out is one of the family ministers in Hungary allegedly, I mean, allegedly in terms of, he hasn't really been charged with the drug thing yet, but he got caught in an orgy of 25 men. Two of those men were originally Polish, were supposedly Polish diplomats. Now, again, he's been big on the whole pro-family thing, been a real driver of that policy, and no surprise, because of the scandal, he was dismissed by Orban's government, and I haven't really heard much more about the two Polish diplomats being involved or anything, but what you have right now is a campaign throughout the media outlets that pick this out in the West, like, oh look, another conservative got caught to be secretly gay, so that means nothing that conservative governments do or right wing governments do matters anymore. Despite the fact he was immediately dismissed. Frankly, In my personal opinion, Orban should have pursued fully the drug charge or gotten, I don't know, what do they call it over there, Minister of Justice to get this guy in some lengthy prison sentence just to make an example out of him. But again, that's where the catch 22 is. And I think that's exactly what the media was trying to go for by publicizing this story, especially right now, especially amid these fights. Either Orban is going to do the thing and dismiss him, and I wouldn't say he looks weak because of it, but maybe not as go as far as he could have, and they're going to rub it in the face like, oh, well, yeah, look at those hypocritical right wing governments. Or the option that, I would personally prefer, but I see the reasons why they didn't get him on some drug charges because allegedly there were drugs at that very very high class party that minister was at, yeah, so to speak. But and
Right.
get him on something and let him rot in a cell. Which again, they would decry Hungary as authoritarian for, well, they put a gay minister in prison, and sort of like how they do whenever Iran executes sex offenders. The fact that, oh, they executed a gay man, you can't have that happening. But it
Uh,
they
can you
want
believe the way they treat their pedos?
I I I can't. But again, they wanted to put Hungary in this situation for an obvious reason. It seems like the story has been largely memory hold. It seems like a lot of people have forgotten about it. But again, it was conspicuous about the timing. I wonder how long they were sitting on this kind of stuff, because this probably wasn't the first occurrence in which this guy did something like that, or they had the information doing something like that before they leaked it. You could blame a security breach on the Orban government and say perhaps he needs to have a tighter leash on his ministers. Perhaps he just needs to go full Stalin and just spy on all his underlings. I don't know. There might be some merit to that. Just keep things fresh, running in line. Maybe a little heavy-handed tactics were necessary, but again, I see this as nothing more than probably the most, I don't even want to say color revolution attempt. I think that's giving that too much credit, but probably the most pathetic delegitimization attempt I've seen probably ever out of all these different things, out of all these media stories that come out. I'm talking particularly Eastern Europe in terms of where they want to overthrow these governments. More pathetic than any of the stories they put out in Ukraine pre-Maidan. More pathetic than any of the Belarusian stories. I don't know. This just seems like how we caught the one thing, and this that means Hungary is as degenerate as the rest of the Western world. Wasn't that something? Isn't it? Doesn't that delegitimize the whole populist and traditional morality movement? Yeah, doesn't it? Like it seems like that's the sort of narrative they're going with, but it's falling on deaf ears, fortunately.
Right, and also in the West, one of the things that has been established now for nearly half a century is the idea that if you're gay or if you're a woman, right, and you rise in politics, right, you have to have these said values that you espouse, right? So Margaret Thatcher was never really the first uh, female leader in the modern Western world, right? Why? Well, because she was a conservative,
It even
right?
took him a while to accept Merkel. It pretty much wasn't until Trump that, I mean, Merkel has always been a member of a so-called center-right party, but it wasn't until the migrant crisis and Trump came along that everyone fell in love with Merkel on the left.
Right. She became the leader of the Western world, which is pretty hilarious. And it's the same rule applies for gay men. That if you are a gay man, then all your values, whether it's hormone blockers for children, whether it's 9-month term abortions, limitless migrants, all of this stuff, that has to come part and parcel of being gay, right? But the truth is, lots of gays don't think gay marriage is good. Lots of them don't think that there should be mass migration. They're frankly very pragmatic. They understand um, how societies work. They understand. They might even have, a love for their nation, and they understand, the biomechanics of how those things happen, and they happen through children and families and creating a stable environment for both, right? And that reducing everything down to the dollar is going to erode that.
Yeah, I
Now,
mean we've
of
entered a
course, I mean, like anybody else, like, I'm grossed out hearing about somebody in an orgy with 25 people. You know, I just, it's revolting, but it doesn't change the fact that everything I've said, and frankly, he's hardly like the only example of a gay right winger that's been, prominent in right wing politics. Like, sorry, it's gone on for a while. I mean, people even made the connection between, say, um, let's say to a certain extent, militarism and homosexuality and right wing politics forming a kind of an axis, right? It's a kind of a parallel axis to, say, traditional men and so on, right? But those are realities. Like, but again, it's in the West, right? In the West, if you're a woman, you have to have these sets of values. This is what you have to espouse. This is what should offend you. This is what should not offend you. This is what you should like. This is what you should not like. Um, it's kind of like, as all societal groups are like slowly being eroded, mainly by capitalism. Um, there's a set of values that enhances that process, right? So, still having some lingering feelings for your nation and its history and so on, um, for them is problematic, right? So, but the fact of the matter is that, there's always been a small select group of gay individuals who have acted in those ways for their countries. But whatever for them, I'm very sure that they think that some Ur-fascism persists in Hungary, and it's taking a hold of this poor man, and hopefully one day he'll be fully liberated.
what I'm really disappointed by in this whole thing that some of the lefties didn't pick up on. I didn't see nearly.
Mm.
In fact, I didn't see the stall. I didn't see anyone post the Maxim Gorky quote. Yeah, but I didn't see that. But again, we have entered a weird era where lesbians and gay men have become relatively more on the, I guess, say, normal side compared to everything else going on when it comes to a lot of the other issues that have arisen out of the LGBTQCIA community. Again, that's not me saying again I condone their behavior or whatever, but it is odd that things have gotten to the point where you may see that, and again, maybe if it came out if he was just a closeted gay man, that may have been one thing. But I do think in a drug fueled orgy with 25 people is a bit different. That is probably better
Yeah.
grounds for dismissal than not. But it it just figures, and again, you'll get them coming out about this. But it seems like the story has largely faded, so I can't complain about that. But yeah, I'm just wondering how this story got out. I wonder, who broke this story. That's the good question. And maybe our boy Orban needs to become a bit more, based on journalists. I know Anu Lukashenko took that route, and you haven't heard of any of those scandals out of Lukashenko's government. That's all I'll say. But
Yeah.
that's backtracking a little bit. But hopefully something like that doesn't happen again. Hopefully there's I don't know, a bit more upstanding people in those positions. But I don't know. I don't think this will harm the Hungarian government in the way a lot of people were either hoping or fearing.
Oh yeah, I mean, sure, there's irony there to be enjoyed, especially if you're from the left. There is an Schadenfreude that you could bask in, but like you say, hey, he's been dismissed, and unless he goes radically to the other side, he's not really going to have any political career left anymore. Like, That's the fact of the matter.
Go join Jobbik or whatever the further right wing party is. Wouldn't that be something? Uh, yeah, that would be funny.
I
But
mean, I think, frankly, even if he were like, let's say he was straight, uh, you know, you're caught in an orgy with 25 people and there's drugs everywhere, and like you're not 20 or 25 anymore, and like you have a high position. It's kind of over. Like, I mean, to put it frankly, it's kind of, your career is kind of over in politics. Like,
yeah, and that's by Western standards. Imagine by Hungarian standards.
right, right. But I mean, even straight politicians, let's say if they were caught in something like that, it's, yeah,
Yeah, but
it's so unseemly, and it would be game over anyhow. And I think he knows that.
I don't know. Maybe he can pull the complete turncoat and paint himself as an exile and flee to the United States or Canada or the UK and set up a center. Maybe like the Foundation for Hungarian Democracy, meet up with Soros, and maybe that'll be his political future. Go meet up with Navalny and Tinovskaya and Guaido, and they can all form a little club. Uh, boy, I joke, but I imagine out of Poland and or Hungary, especially Hungary, there will be some prominent dissident that sets up some foundation or some organization in the West that complains about Fidesz and
Oh, for
Hungary and
sure.
Orban and the ruling government, especially under a Biden administration. I could see again the Foundation for Hungarian Democracy, based out of New York, headed by some no-name Hungarian politician that had a failure of a career, and funded by George Soros. I can see it already. Speaking at the 2024 DNC, no less. Maybe that's what I'll be doing. Maybe he'll be up there with Navalny. But with that out of the way, you want to get into some of the more, I don't know how I'd put this, more intense news of the week out of the Middle East.
Sure.
So, beginning with Iran, a prominent Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated, and I'm going to try to say his name the best of my ability. That is Fakhrizadeh. 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 There we go. He was assassinated, which was initially suspected to be by Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, which it can be pinpoint down to, yeah, it's either one of the two. I haven't seen if there's been word on who it is, but point being, especially in this sort of conflict, it's sort of one and the same. And the Iranians have vowed retaliation, and of course, Trump was saying on Twitter, now again, take that for what you will, that we're locked and loaded, sort of the same rhetoric he had when the oil tankers were being sunk last summer. And things are tense in the Middle East, the tensest they've been in quite some time. And this all goes back to, will Trump deliver a final strike on Iran as his final act in office and leave Biden with an upcoming war with Iran and make him wade through that situation? Again, that's all been kicked around, it's all been speculated. We talked about that on the show a couple episodes ago. But, as I said before, I don't think this changes it, but I don't see it. But it does set an interesting tone. And, of course, Israel actually today put out a statement that they were concerned about Washington rejoining the Iran deal. Just a couple weeks after he congratulates Biden on his victory with Kamala Harris. So you're already seeing the
Yeah.
pieces
And
fall
you're
into
seeing an
place.
acceleration of the program as well.
Yes,
Iran is just going to double down.
and at this point, I think unless there's like an all-out invasion that occurs probably by January, Iran is going to be a nuclear state, and that's something the world stage is going to learn to accept for better and for worse. But what we have happening right now, I don't think the United States is going to get involved. I don't think we're going to strike Iran or anything like that. But you're seeing growing tensions, yet again, growing tensions in a new theater as the return to normal president is presumably about to assume office. Because You have Biden's return to normal. You have the situation going on with China. You have the situation going on in Eastern Europe, and now handed another Middle Eastern situation on top of Syria, which we will discuss here in the next couple minutes. But it's it's still way too early to tell what's really going to come of this because it seems like the initial flare up was almost about a week ago. Think that was I think that was last weekend. I think it was last Saturday when that happened. So you had a lot of tension focused on that. Of course, being a holiday week in the United States, a lot of people went on a lot of people's radar, including my own. I actually didn't figure out about this until a few days afterwards. And after all of that, looking at all of that, we've seen similar things. This is nowhere near as big as the Soleimani assassination, or some of the even assassinations that happened pre-Soleimani. That when Israel struck the Iranian reactor in what was that, 2011? Uh,
Right, and even before then, there were strikes. Like this is not the first time that Iranian scientists were killed for for being part of Iran's nuclear program or just nuclear scientists. Period. Whether they were working toward developing nuclear arms or not. Um, so it isn't. I mean, it's a blow for sure. And in fact, even Hezbollah has said that they may move some of their headquarters out of Syria and Lebanon and into Iran. But then you have the problem of, a lot of Iranians study in Western universities and are themselves compromised, right? I mean, this guy went around with like his only protection was another car, and his car didn't even have bulletproof glass or bulletproof siding, um, which seems ridiculous, but on the face of it, but at the same time, like Iran is it does have a kind of a martyr cult, so in a way, it galvanizes them as well. It adds a certain kind of determination, um, no matter how hopeless that may seem from, say, Western eyes. But it does work that way, and so the program is going to go on, as you say.
and that's also on top of what we covered last week, the strikes on the Saudi oil fields coming from Yemen yet again, Iranian
Yeah.
proxies in Yemen. So again, there's a lot on the president-elect's plate going forward, and I don't think the severe retaliation that Rouhani has vowed is going to come anytime soon, if at all, or in the form that we expect. Now, of course, we have the flare-ups in Iraq that we've had consistently, but again, I don't see another shelling of the U.S. embassy or attacks on U.S. troops in Syria or in Afghanistan or wherever. But that is also interesting. It's going to see, I don't know, maybe the Iranians with this rhetoric are testing the water, seeing, well, how does Biden, who is presumably going to be the next president, going to react to this? Is he going to sign on to the hawkish rhetoric, or is he going to take a more conciliatory attitude towards it? And like I said, it could just be one giant test of Biden or Kamala at this rate, seeing how things are going with that, and whether or not they think they
Well,
have the hopes of reviving a deal. Even though, again, I think Iran, I think this has probably sealed the deal this past year that Iran is going nuclear, and there's not really any changing that.
right, and you can see the uptick in ISIS. Frankly, we'll get to Syria, but there was an attack on an Iraqi oil field by ISIS, so you could argue that um, a strategy of the Biden administration will be to reintroduce funding, uh, through various means to ISIS, because one of the important areas, theaters of conflict and influence for Iran is Iraq and Syria. So I would say that you're going to see more funding. And, based on the articles that we spoke about last week, where generals had had kept secret from Trump the amount of troops that were actually in Syria, kind of parallels this reemergence, the slow but steady reemergence of ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. And it does feel like it was a kind of a preparation for a Biden victory as well.
That's an interesting way to put it, and I suppose that we can pull up our Syria maps, where again there has been the resurgence in ISIS, but also quite a bit of Turkish activity against the Kurds. And we'll start with the ISIS news. So they've been having attacks on the oil fields and on areas in eastern Syria, in which you see actual American forces that have been left in the country have moved from the oil fields up north to further south to protect these Kurdish controlled oil fields. And again, there's been skirmishes on the Syrian Iraqi border with security forces and military of both countries against ISIS and other terrorist organizations. You've had, of course, last week Israeli strikes in the country, and it looks like the main activity is in northwestern Syria, as usual, and it's been the Turkish attacks on shelling on Kurdish forces. And you've had the Turkish backed forces, such as Al Sham or HTS or whatever they've rebranded to at this point, going against the Kurdish forces rather than the Syrian forces. And this is while Syrian forces and their allies are continuing their advance to the point where it's collapsed into infighting of Assad's enemies and Assad's, I would say, non-belligerent rivals in the form of the Kurds. Because it's not like the Kurds and the Assad government are fighting right now, but again, at the end of the day, it's not exactly like their interests align either. Even though you're still getting withdrawals of Turkish forces from the country, you're still getting them going out of Turkey to Libya. The conflict in Azerbaijan has died down, so not so much there anymore. But you're getting them leaving the country because, again, Turkey is they've sort of, cut their losses in Syria, and their main concern seems to be Kurdish shells on their border as opposed to Syrian government proper on their border, which again makes sense. It's the Kurds are non-state actors. Their rivalry is almost explicit with Turkey, whereas the Syrian government can be negotiated with, if not directly, at least through Russia. So things again, they're wrapping up. They're going the way I expect them to, as we would see with the transition of a president that hasn't taken office yet. Because I'm not saying Biden's going to be successful. I'm not saying it's going to be very effective, but Biden's going to be much more involved in Syria than Trump was, and I think that will be mainly balancing the support of the Kurds with appeasing Turkey, maybe funding to jihadist groups here and there. Maybe, as you said, this has to do with the resurgence of ISIS in the east.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. has also did some uh, air-based military maneuvers today in the eastern section. I think it's called
Based on what?
But there's an interest. One of the members of Biden's incoming cabinet is Neera Tanden, and I'll read you a little email that she wrote back in 2011. This was part of the WikiLeaks dump from 2016. October 21st, 2011. It's addressed to Faiz Shakir, Peter Jewell, Benjamin Armbuster, and a few other people. The subject is, should Libya pay us back? She writes, we have a giant deficit. They have a lot of oil. Most Americans would choose not to engage in this world because of that deficit. If we want to continue to engage in the world, gestures like having oil-rich countries partially pay us back doesn't seem crazy to me. Do we prefer cuts to Head Start or WIC or Medicaid? Because we live in in deficit politics, and that's what is happening and will be happening even more. It's so prophetic. It is also so much of like that second term or the end of the first term of Obama. It's really quite striking, and you can even see a parallel, with Trump's claim to stay in Syria in order to, quote unquote, protect the oil. But I don't see anything vastly different with Biden coming in. I would probably see a reemergence of ISIS. I think they're going to go back to that playbook, and this will be one of the reasons. It's a deficit economy. That's what they're in, and they believe that they literally believe that oil is theirs. That Libya, Syria, Iraq, all of those countries, they owe America that oil. It's completely preposterous. It's the most hubristic thing I've ever read. But there we are.
Yeah, it's not even like the cool old kind of colonialism where they just go in and take it. It's oh, you owe us this because X, Y, and Z. It's lawyer imperialism. It's like we don't. It's like we're living in an era where we have to expend our resources on governing these neo colonies, and we don't even get to do it the cool way or the efficient way or any way that has any sort of benefit to anyone at all, except I don't know, maybe a few elites here and there. Not even the entire elite because they're constantly feuding over what to do because of their conflicting interests. But I suppose that describes the entire post World War II uh, geopolitical situation, doesn't it?
It does.
And I suppose there's not really any more we can say beyond that, unless you have anything
Yeah.
we missed.
There probably is. There always is. I just can't think of it right now.
I mean, there's a brewing conflict in Ethiopia, but again, it seems too fresh to touch. I think we still need a little more information before we really get into the details and what's going on there. But
Oh, you know what? There is something, and I think I meant to bring it up last episode. Just a little short thing on Macron, and it's not about him pressuring Lebanon to come up with a new government. I think he doesn't realize he's entered into a quagmire there, but it has to do with a leaked video from a certain journalist in France. Now, I take this with a grain of salt because, for all we know, this is simply like, in the video, it's basically, it's, Macron is apparently has acknowledged, it's Mark Idenweld who claims that Macron has acknowledged the great replacement and that his cabinet is filled with members who have read the basic outlines of the Great Replacement and understand what I mean. Honestly, this feels like a sting. It feels like it's just pressure on Macron. I will say, though, you could argue that there is something to substantiate that, and that is ministers in Macron's cabinet have come out and opposed legislating something similar to critical race theory, which is happening in the U.S. With the Biden administration. So, that's still a step away from, Macron is like literally talking about the Great Replacement, y'all. He has seen the Lauren Southern documentaries. I mean, I'm sure he has, to be quite honest, but not for the same reasons. Um, Again, we should always take these news bites with a grain of salt because how different is his migration policy going to be? Especially if, as we mentioned earlier, let's say there's a resurgence of ISIS somehow, and that drives yet another wave of refugees and migrants. I'll wait. I'll wait. But elections in France are still a year away, and you know. But I will grant that his ministers are actually looking at critical race theory is something that's going to be very problematic for France. And obviously, no country can exist. I mean, the whole point of education is that you have some kind of baseline for everybody that can agree on, regardless of their ethnicity and race, and that somehow unifies the country. If the educational system is about defining the races and redefining the grievances, that can't happen.
Oh yeah, I mean it's honestly, ironically enough, a point in favor of the civic nationalists in that debate, where you do need something that transcends race to unite you. Not that race, ethnicity isn't important, but again, you also do need a civic identity, and that when you start to deconstruct that civic identity, it's unless you have something immediately to replace it, and even then, you're digging yourself into a very deep hole. But
Yeah.
I was joking about how long our year in review episode's going to be, but this one got up there a little bit, and it's still good content. This is almost the length of the episode we had Ferengi in on, which we'll need to get him on. I think he's scheduled for February
Mhm.
based on what? Based on the fact that we've had him on 6 months apart the first two times. So I suppose three times sets a trend. So I'll see what he's doing. Hopefully we can get something scheduled. Probably not this far in advance, but I'll be in touch with him. I'll if you know anyone interesting that you wants to talk to, just leave it in the comments. Whatever. But so long as this site will let me, and so long as I have the time and I have the situation in my personal life where I'm able to do this, I will keep chugging along every week or so, and you will get the news or our takes on the news more so from us. And I guess we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.